Greetings, friends and comrades, and welcome to the fifth hearing of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism, Sanctions, Blockades, and Economic Coercive Measures. My name is Hedia Dotaqi, and together with Dr. Nina Farnia, we will be serving as the rapporteurs of the hearing and will be moderating the session today. Today we'll be hearing about the impact of sanctions on the Syrian Arab Republic. This is an especially important hearing, both in light of the ongoing imperialist aggression and US intervention in Syria, and the recent devastating earthquake, which affected thousands in the country, and once again showcased the myth of what's known as targeted sanctions. We witnessed how sanctions regimes were designed to hinder the rescue, relief, and reconstruction efforts in the country and stopped humanitarian aid to reach the people. We are joined today by a panel of distinguished jurors, including Mohammed Tai, Michael Deutsch, Jerry Buhil, Victor Good, and Charlotte Cates. And because especially we're going to have a longer hearing than usual, I encourage everyone to go to our website at sanctionstribunal.org to learn more about our jurors, our rapporteurs, and the team of the tribunal and the tribunal efforts in general. We are providing a simultaneous Arabic translation for today's hearing. So if you would like to listen to the hearing in Arabic, please go to the interpretation item at the bottom of your screen and choose Arabic. And if you would like to hear the witnesses in English, please choose English and be in the English room. If you're in your phone, you're able to find this option in the more of the three dots that are available in your phone, and you can choose the settings as well. Okay, so we are honored today to be joined by a panel of 6 experts and witnesses, including Patrick Higgins, Dr. Louis Alday, Dr. Hala Al-Assad, Dr. Bashir Mohammed, and Dr. Adnan Azoui, as well as Johnny Achi. They will be testifying on different negative impact of sanctions on Syria, and as you know, this is the first hearing that we're going to have 6 testimonies because of the special importance of Syria. So bear with us as we go through the testimonies and the discussions as well. The first witness of today's hearing is Patrick Higgins. Patrick is a writer and researcher focused on the history of US imperialism in the Arab region. He has written extensively over the past decade about the contemporary US war in Syria. His latest article on the subject of gunning for Damascus, this US war on the Syrian Arab Republic, is due out in the upcoming spring in the Middle East Critique. Patrick, please take it away.
Okay, real quickly, just a thumbs up. Everybody can hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
I want to thank the organizers, and I'm also going to get right into it. I apologize in advance if I move briskly through the testimony. It's just for reasons of timing. Okay. Since 2011, the United States, with and through its regional allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Turkey, has been deliberately targeting Syria through coercive measures using violence as well as forced deprivation, particularly in the form of sanctions. About such a campaign, there can be no doubt, and you will hear extensive evidence for that today. I want to begin today's proceedings by answering the question of why the US is targeting Syria. The US, through its state managers and its vast institutions, both political and military, acts with premeditation, and it has clear motives. In order to establish motive, however, it is first helpful to turn to the historical timeline before 2011 and to avoid siloing post-2011 events in Syria from the rest of the world by focusing too narrowly on, say, its head of state as a totalizing comic book villain capable of explaining every dark turn in recent Syrian history. Rather, We need to examine the roles of the US and Syria in the world system respectively and relationally. There exists a social relation, a power dynamic between these two countries. Of course, Syria has played a significant cultural and historic role in the West Asian Arab region since antiquity, and that placement led to its playing a significant political role for Arab national identity, a prerequisite for Arab national resistance in the 20th century. Syria served as the primary base of operations for the overthrow of the Ottoman regional system, which existed from the 16th century through 1918. It again served as a major headquarters for anti-French and anti-British mass strikes, demonstrations, and military operations between 1918 and 1945. When, in the early 20th century, neighboring Palestine began to undergo colonization from the nascent Zionist movement, Syrian leaders, most notably Izzeldin al-Qassam, nurtured a pan-Arab consciousness by leading Syrian brigades into Palestine to confront the Zionist settlements and the mandate installations, including military posts and the British railway system. The pressure from Syrians, combined with the pressure of anti-colonial movements globally, made the direct administration of colonial holdings unsustainable for Britain and France. In that sense, Syria forced the transition from a British-led world system to a US-led world system after World War II, when the US was faced with having to uphold the vestiges of the colonial system as inexpensively as possible. The most immediate problem that Syrians created for the US was the lead they took in transforming national liberation, that is, fighting for Syrian sovereignty over governance, into social revolution, that is, redistributing power from the old landed elites and colonial collaborators to the impoverished peasants of the countryside. Such policies went hand in hand with maintaining the freedom of Syrians to confront hostile powers and mobilize resources to support other anti-colonial struggles. For example, in 1948, Syria hosted the volunteer-run Arab Liberation Army, whose members flooded into Palestine to confront the Zionist movement during the Nakba. As the United States wanted as quote-unquote quiet a situation as possible in Palestine so it could invest its military elsewhere, I believe this policy to have been a major contributor for the US support for the 1949 coup d'etat in Syria. After the 1955 return of the deposed leader, Shukri al-Kuwaitli, the Syrian Republic mobilized state resources to support the Algerian Revolution against French occupation. After the ascent of the Ba'ath Party to state power in the 1960s, Syria became the main state support line early on, geographically, financially, militarily, logistically, for the rising Palestinian commando movement, which brought the method of people's war to the heart of the Zionist settler movement in order to seize the Palestinian refugees' right of return to their homeland. The question I want to ask now, what was it about Syria, not only its post-war governments, but also its attached state structures in society, that led it to take such a proactive role in Palestinian liberation and confronting Israel relative to other Arab states? My response will focus on one example of the tension between Syria and Israel, and then I'll explain why such a tension automatically puts Syria at odds with Israel's main backer, the United States. As I mentioned, after World War II, the US wanted stability in Palestine. As the British were retreating, the main way for the US to maintain that stability without directly intervening and overextending its military so that it could focus money and resources on European redevelopment, and it needed to keep the Soviet Union out of Europe as it saw it. The way to do this, it was thought, was to support the Zionist movement and the establishment of Israel. Partition, for them, was supposed to be a settlement. Of course, as we see now, it's given us a century of war. But Israel, in order to be created, required electricity. And to generate electricity, it needed water. So the US, using one of its corporations, the Tennessee Valley Authority, created a plan, sometimes known as the Johnston Plan, by which water that could otherwise be used for Arab agricultural development would be redirected towards Zionist settlement development and, of course, Zionist military development. Because Syria had the capacity to develop its own water resources independently, it broke from the plan. Neighboring Jordan, however, stood to gain more than Syria under the plan from higher proportions of water flushing through the Jordan Valley. So Jordan ultimately joined the US-Israeli plan. And that from that point on, whenever Syria dared to assert sovereignty over its water resources, Israel attacked it. And I'll give you an example. Just look up Operation Olive Leaves for a clear example of this. And it's no coincidence that Israel, when it stole Syrian land in the Golan Heights in the aggression of 1967, took over a major water spring that was to be utilized under that previous Johnston plan, the Banya Spring, which now the Zionist occupiers call the Herman Spring. So to put it bluntly, because Israel was built on resources stolen from Arab peoples, first their land, and then their labor, and then their water, there has existed an inherent permanent antagonism between Israeli colonialism and Syrian independence, which includes the right to independent development. And because Israel was from the beginning a fixture, a foundation of the US order for the region, first a necessary condition for stability, of course we must ask stability for whom, and then as a bulwark against the Palestinian refugees with which Syrian interests have frequently overlapped, it has led to an antagonism between the US and Syria. So there exists a structural antagonism here between a large, strong country and a small, relatively poor one. But as you will see in the testimonies today, since 2011, US policy managers have planned and executed attacks on Syria in specific, deliberate ways. Based on this core tension that I have brought up between Syria's various waves of revolution and the US's world order, I will present to you now the 4 major interconnected reasons why the US has pursued these attacks. I am at this moment establishing motive, outlining intent on the part of the US regime, and I draw these conclusions from a review of the US National Security Archives. First, Syria's historic relationship with Russia, which beginning with the Soviet Union, allowed for alternative development technologically, militarily, and otherwise. This was a necessary condition for Syria's relative freedom of movement from US constraints regionally. Second, Syria's relative economic independence, beginning with the land reform programs of 1958, escalating with the Ba'ath programs of 1963 and after, which in the words of one CIA report, quote unquote, pushed many professional people and merchants to remove themselves or their assets to more stable environments outside the country. And also around this time, Syria nationalized territory from the Iraqi Petroleum Company, which Britain was using to make good on its post-war debt to the US. The Syrian authorities demanded higher royalty payments on those oil pipelines. In other words, what went to the Syrian people, social welfare, reinvestment drawn from those royalties, necessarily did not go to US banks. Third, Syria's role in third world solidarity and material support for national liberation movements, which persisted even in some important forms after the various rollbacks of the post-1970 Assad government, starting with hosting the 1971 Executive Committee session for the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, which strategized against the US's then going illegal, murderous war on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And fourth, for pan-Arabism and anti-Zionism. Most recently, and more relevant to the reasoning behind the sanctions today since the 2000s, Syria has been the main conduit between Iran, the Lebanese resistance, and the Palestinian resistance, whose right to armed self-defense from invasion and aggression has been firmly established under international law. Moving from the momentum of the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, which was a major Syrian trade partner, and also the momentum of the post-9/11 state of emergency, the legal state of exception out of which the US implemented a global form of martial law it gave the name the War on Terror, the US moved to extinguish the so-called holdouts from the Cold War and the supply lines to the resistance to its imposed order for the Arab region. For the 4 primary reasons I named, US policy planners in the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, the Pentagon, and now 4 White House administrations, beginning with the second Bush administration, have at various junctures put up capital and arranged weapons for proxy Contra militias at staging grounds in the Gulf, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, even Libya and Bosnia, sponsored media channels and propaganda operations, sponsored separatists, launched aerial bombing campaigns, implemented sanctions, and into the vacuum of devastated areas of Syria, occupied the country with Marines and special forces, specifically the land which provides the majority of the national oil supply. Combined with the sanctions, the oil theft has deprived Syria of the ability to raise needed revenue to fund post-war reconstruction of the country. In so doing, the US is acting upon intelligence the CIA gathered in the 1980s when Syria's then newly discovered oil fields were identified as the source of possible weakness in the country's developmental model. I am quoting directly from a 1986 CIA assessment here when I say, quote unquote, oil is central to Syria's economic health, the report said. And at the time, it accounted for up to 60% of Syria's exports. Although it was still a net importer of oil, depending on Iranian crude to develop its resources, and in dire need of Western monopolized supplies and expertise. Although Syria at the time was driving towards self-sufficiency in oil production, a lack of inputs forced the country into a foreign exchange deficit, a process that is playing out even more starkly now today. The CIA was, by the way, discussing in 1986 the very oil fields its troops captured in 2017. The US does not, of course, actually need the oil it is stealing in any way whatsoever. The point is, rather, to block Syria from being able to use oil to resupply its reserve currency and buy supplies necessary to reconstruction. The US is doing this to hold Syria hostage for its foreign policy. That is, its friendly relations with Russia, Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine. The US wants to blackmail Syria into making political concessions. If you want to hear this intent described explicitly, I advise you to go to YouTube and look up Trump's special representative for Syria, James Jeffrey, discuss Syrian affairs at the Aspen Institute in 2019. The talk is titled, The Role of the US in Syria, Planning for the Future. And about the 11-minute mark in that talk, he states outright that the Syrian Arab Republic could not get back 50% of its arable land and 66% of its oil reserves without negotiating with the US, which in typical reform, he cloaks in the phrase international community, and removing Iran from the country. With this evidence brought forth, I want to end with an appeal to American citizens to compel the government to which we pay taxes to abide by international law and end its aggressions, both military and economic, against Syria. We must insist that Syria is a sovereign country that must be allowed to pursue a policy of its choosing. Excuses to do otherwise for Americans have diminished. The lessons of Vietnam, El Salvador, and elsewhere are behind us, the most important of which is that whatever we allow the US government to do to non-US peoples will boomerang back upon us, somehow in some way, sooner or later. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for clearly establishing the intent of sanction, which is a great way to start today's testimony. Thank you. Our next witness is Dr. Louis Alday, who is a writer and historian whose research focuses on propaganda, British imperialism in the Middle East, and resistance to it. He previously lived in Syria and has spent a number of years trying to counter the prevailing imperialist narrative about the country and the war that has been waged against it. Louis, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Same question as Patrick. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. And if I share this, you see this?
Yes.
Yep. Cool. So yeah, I'd echo Patrick. Thank you very much to the organizers, the other participants, and everyone involved in this really important event. And thank you actually, especially to Patrick, for that really brilliant and really important historical contextualization. I think you burst several myths in a very concise space. I think two really stuck out to me that are very, very dominantly held or believed positions. One, that this somehow began in 2011 and not before. And secondly, that the US is motivated by a desire to stop violence or somehow protect the Syrian people or improve the conditions of the Syrian people. I think you demonstrated very well what nonsense that is. And I suppose I want to build it on that in some way before we hear the more direct testimonies of the the awful impact of these monstrous sanctions and some of the specifics of that impact. And I want to speak about the issue of sanctions in the context of the Western media coverage and the dominant kind of mainstream acceptable narrative on what has happened and what is happening in Syria in the Western public sphere, which after now more than a decade of intense propaganda that has deliberately shaped a self-serving imperialist narrative, not only in the media, but throughout large swathes of academia, and also lamentably in what we would call many leftist spaces even. So as these kind of examples are just kind of drop in the ocean of anyone who has attempted to question, critique, or push back upon this self-serving imperialist narrative has been slandered, attacked, sidelined, or attacked or marginalized in some way, and whether that's being called, you know, the typical refrain of dictator apologists, or specifically Assad apologists or Assadists, or there is an idea pushed that, you know, this simple anti-imperialist position is somehow too unnuanced and doesn't apply in this scenario, and therefore those of us who seek to point out the role of US imperialism in this situation are somehow Orientalist or racist, or we are fools, or as one of them says there, you know, the anti-imperialism of idiots. This is the kind of public discourse in which those of us who've tried to speak about sanctions have been forced to operate in. And predictably, when sanctions have been, or when we do try to speak about sanctions, these same arguments and attacks are used against us. You know, this is a very familiar tactic. It was used during.
I say it in Go Syria. I was just saying, but I'm not gonna say. I will.
It was used on.
I am.
I'm not sure what that was. It's a familiar tactic. It was used during the 90s with Saddam Hussein and the sanctions on Iraq. It was used regarding Gaddafi, Milosevic. It's being used now with Putin. This very leader-focused framing that allows no nuance or pushback to what is the dominant narrative. And unfortunately, intimidation of this kind, because often it is actually direct intimidation as well, and threatening of livelihoods and positions and jobs. It's a relatively successful means of policing the acceptable or polite discourse. And one impact of that is that sanctions, and specifically sanctions on Syria and their impact, have often just simply been ignored or not reported on, or people who would otherwise want to talk about the impact of them are second guess doing so, or they are intimidated or afraid from doing so, or they don't do as vociferously as they would otherwise. And again, those who do will be attacked as Assadists, Assad apologists, dictator apologists, anti-imperialist fools, etc. However, in spite of that intimidation and that toxic atmosphere, the impact of the sanctions is not unknown. It has been reported. That's very important to state at this point. You know, this is not an unknown phenomenon, and actually much of this reporting, or calls for the sanctions to be lifted, or analysis of their impact, it actually predates the tightening and the intensification of these sanctions that took place with the Caesar Act in 2019. And even though, for the reasons I've just described, they have very often not made it through to mainstream media, since, you know, at least 2015, 2016, aid and other humanitarian organizations and a limited number of academic studies have made very clear the devastating impact and the human suffering caused by the US sanctions on Syria. For example, in this image here, that the top left, that was a leaked UN report from 2016, which made very, very clear the extent of the suffering that was being caused and the interconnected ways in which the sanctions were impacting the Syrian population. And I think to some extent, this attention and this steady, but if marginalized chorus of calls for the sanctions to be lifted, I think it received a boost at the end of last year when the UN Special Rapporteur, Dr. Elena Dalhan, visited, and immediately following her visit, before she had even issued her formal report, she outright called for the sanctions to be lifted, and in her words, described them as suffocating the Syrian people, that had shattered the state's capability to respond to the needs of the population. Now, this dynamic, I think, became even more pronounced after the devastating earthquake earlier this year, for obvious reasons. And there has been a growing call, a growing chorus of voices for the sanctions to be lifted. Now, in addition to the US essentially almost being forced into agreeing to a easing of sanctions, these growing calls for lifting them completely prompted a damage limitation exercise, let's say a PR exercise from those invested in maintaining them. Some of that exercise took very crude formats such as this, a Washington Post op-ed by Wael al-Zayed, a US State Department, former US State Department employee, although he's clearly still serving the same agenda and the same masters, just flat out lying and saying that lifting sanctions is not going to help the earthquake victims. So, very crude, very dishonest, very disgusting. What I found quite interesting is that that same argument was then picked up and effectively laundered by what many people would mistakenly believe to be a kind of alternative or even leftist outlet, such as The Intercept. And as you can see here, although it's framed in a slightly more, ostensibly nuanced way, it is essentially recycling the same argument. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, literally quoting the same person again, Wael al-Zayed, saying that lifting sanctions isn't going to help. And then also quoting another individual from an imperialist-friendly think tank called the Middle East Institute, Karam Sha'ar, who basically says that it's actually the regime to blame, and sanctions are not particularly, not really the main issue. So some of the response since the earthquake has been this very, very dishonest, very blatant pushback. But what I want to talk about more is some of the a more kind of insidious and systemic problem with the way that the sanctions are framed and the way in which the impact is reported. And that's that even when the devastating impact on the ground is acknowledged and is reported, the common refrain, as you can see from these multiple examples here, the common refrain is that the sanctions are pointless, or they can't solve the problem, or they're not working, or they, the pointless cruelty, or what are they even good for? Or they shouldn't be lifted, but they should be improved, they should be tweaked, they should be reformed. Now, and this is virtually kind of across the board. When it is acknowledged, it is consistently implied that the suffering is unintended. Or if it is intended, the US doesn't really know why it's doing it. It's just pointless, and it's blundering, and it's lost, and it's confused in a kind of quagmire of Syria policy. Now, this inability or unwillingness to consider that there is a difference between the US's commonly stated aims and their actual intent is damaging and misleading in a number of ways. And I think we need to keep this in mind when we listen to the testimonies that come after me. So what this framing does is it perpetuates the myth of a well-intentioned US that wants to stop violence and punish the alleged perpetrators of that violence, thus concealing the true motivations and intent that, as Patrick so fantastically showed, do occasionally sneak out in more kind of candid settings, such as when James Jeffrey was speaking at the Aspen Institute. The other thing that this framing does, and I've already alluded to this, is it promotes the idea of a kind of bumbling empire in which the US supposedly makes the same mistakes again and again and again, and doesn't even know its own interests or its own strategic agenda, just kind of moving from one foreign policy blunder to another with the same results, which are somehow the unintended results every single time. A third thing that this framing does is it uncritically accepts the dominant imperialist narrative, which I've already spoken about. And so what it does is it accepts who or what the key drivers of violence are and were, and it frequently ignores or massively downplays the US and allies' direct role in enormous physical destruction inside Syria, ongoing proxy war, and the aforementioned military occupation of Syrian territory as described by Patrick. And all of these things exacerbate and contribute to the impact of the sanctions enormously, and they all serve the same agenda. Another thing that this framing does is frequently perpetuates the leader-focused framing that is so typical of these kind of narratives, and pushes the idea that there is a clear-cut and binary distinction between Assad or the Assad regime and a largely homogenous Syrian people on the other side who are unanimously opposed to that regime. And I think perhaps most insidiously, the impact of this framing, or the effect of this framing, is that it does not question and often actually supports the US's moral legitimacy and right to act unilaterally in this way with virtually global jurisdiction. And it promotes an idea that if they were working, then these sanctions would be fine. And the issue is actually them not achieving their aims, not that they are an outrage in the first place, that they should never exist. And the US has no right or legitimacy to impose them on Syria or anywhere else in the first place. As just two quick examples of the kind of reporting I'm talking about, the first one here, and they both essentially do the same thing. So they're both, and in their own ways, they're both actually fairly strong articles in terms of the impact of the sanctions. And notice here that they are both from before 2019, so they are from before the Caesar Act, before things have gotten even worse. What the first one does is, as you can see, the sanctions intended, and the second one, they were supposed to do this, but instead they're doing this. And so what they do is they take the stated justifications and aims at face value, and they set up a supposed contradiction between aim and result. And you know, this position to me is reminiscent of those who would describe, for example, the US-led peace process as a failure, or the war on drugs as not working. And what in both cases, and it applies to this as well, what they're not doing is considering what the real intent of these processes is. So what does this commonly get put down to according to the common narrative? So as this very illustrative example from 2020 shows, even when the impact of the sanctions is acknowledged, it is explained by confusion, ineptitude, policy failure, blundering. And so what the idea that this reporting gives is of a kind of confused US moving from one mistake or blunder to another, and that often somehow ignorant of the impact that the sanctions are causing, and seemingly confused as to what its agendas and interests are. So what is the reality if I'm pushing back against that idea? And I think I just want to make an important caveat here. My argument is not that the US is omnipotent somehow and does not make mistakes or miscalculations. Of course it does. Nor am I arguing that there are not internal disagreements and subsequent recalculations. But what the US government is definitely not is ignorant of the human suffering that maintaining its hegemony around the world entails. And on the contrary, it ruthlessly pursues its interests from an informed and calculated perspective. And that is why you have individuals, and this is just an example, that's why you have individuals such as Richard Nephew, who in their own sick terminology are experts in honing the art of sanctions. And as the book description here states very clearly, sanctions are about the application of pain against a target. And that pain, I contend, is deliberate, calculated, measured, and intended. And one reason they are able to hone, as I say, what they sickly refer to as the art of sanctions is the US has decades of experience and decades of case studies and statistics and knowledge. Syria itself has been subject to sanctions since 1979. Cuba has been subject to sanctions for over half a century. They are well aware of the impact of sanctions. Again, whenever when we listen to the participants that follow me, I think that is what needs to be kept in mind. Now, whenever I discuss sanctions, or whenever I think about sanctions, this quote comes to my mind and has often done since I read it for the first time many years ago. And I think it's worth reading in full. So this is UNICEF's senior representative in Iraq in 2000. So she's looking back retrospectively on the previous decade of sanctions against Iraq. Change in 10 years is unparalleled in my experience. In 1989, the literacy rate was 95%, and 93% of the population had free access to modern health facilities. The phenomenon of street children or children begging was unheard of. Iraq had reached the stage where the basic indicators we used to measure the overall well-being of human beings, including children, were some of the best in the world. Now it is among the bottom 20%. In 10 years, child mortality has gone from one of the lowest in the world to the highest. There is no way in which those US officials responsible for designing, implementing, and sustaining these sanctions are ignorant of information such as this. On the contrary, they study it and they hone the ability to inflict damage in this way. That quote from Anupama Singh was in a John Pilger article from The Guardian in the year 2000. And rereading that article for the preparation of this presentation, I was struck by the fact that it was extremely similar to an article written by Nabi Boulos almost 20 years later. In one case, it's Iraqi doctors. In the one almost 20 years later, it's Syrian doctors. Very similar lamentations about the impact of the sanctions, needless deaths, the suffering of cancer patients. This is only extracts, but if you read the details of the articles are there. If you read the articles, they are so depressingly and infuriatingly similar. And the mainstream narrative would have us believe that the US is somehow making the same mistake again. And even though they wanted it to do this, it's actually doing this. And again, I would contend that they are doing exactly what they are supposed to do. And in that same John Pilger article, he quotes Dennis Halliday. Now, Dennis Halliday was the UN coordinator of humanitarian relief to Iraq, so he was essentially responsible for the sanctions program. And when he resigned from his role in 1998, he said, "I am resigning because the policy of economic sanctions is totally bankrupt. We are in the process of destroying an entire society. It is as simple and terrifying as that. 5,000 children are dying every month." Now, it's this sentiment from Halliday that I think must be kept in mind when we listen to the direct testimonies today. This is not an unknown, unintended, accidental impact. These sanctions are created and applied with known and intended outcomes, and they constitute a deliberate and systematic attempt by the US to remove the ability for the means of social reproduction from the Syrian state, a deliberate program of de-development. And this entails undermining access to food, shelter, education, clean water, employment, all the fundamentals of life. And it has nothing to do with wanting to stop violence or protect the Syrian people, quote unquote, or negotiate a political solution, which it has made very clear it has no interest in. Rather, as Patrick so powerfully showed, it is both punishment and attempted blackmail against the Syrian government, largely but not solely, because of its support for anti-imperialist liberation movements such as Hezbollah and the Palestinian factions. So I think it's with this in mind that we must listen to those speaking after me and remember that this suffering is not an accident. It's not a result of mere blundering. It is intentional and it is by design. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Louis, for your powerful testimony and for the important unpacking of this myth of unintended consequences of sanctions or targeted sanctions, which is intentionally and unintentionally reproduced in a lot of literature in sanctions. So this was very important, and thank you so much for providing us with this valuable insight. Our next witness is Dr. Hala Al-Assad, who is a lawyer and the Secretary General of the League of the Arab Nation from the Syrian Arab Republic. Dr. Al-Assad resided in the country and never left throughout the years of hybrid and proxy war on her country. She holds an MA in international law and a PhD in political science, and is a member of the General Secretariat of the Arab Center for Documentation of War Crimes and Legal Prosecution. Dr. Hala, I know you are having difficulty with electricity right now. We really, really appreciate that you're here today.
Hello for everyone. سأبدأ.
I will start speaking right now to save time. The crime starts, which are unilateral against the Syrian people and against the Syrian state. It's unilateral and imposed on the people. The people have tried to avoid these war, but then this war was imposed on the people, which starved the people and starved the regime and has led to many deaths on many fields. And this is a collective punishment. In this part of the world, the sanctions affected land, affected animals, affected humans, and they confiscated the rights of the people of this land. These sanctions stole its resources and denied access to its own resources. That's only because the Syrian people were adamant that they want to a sovereign state and not be a functionary state. The economic sanctions on the people made it impossible to produce, import, and export anything. These unilateral sanctions led to the living standards of the regular citizens. Medicine, food are sanctioned as well, and so they cannot be imported or exported. And so this had led to endless lines of people waiting for medicine and healthcare and food. These sanctions by the US and then followed by the Europeans and any additional unilateral sanctions, and particularly the categorization of these sanctions as a legal concept does not make any sense because it's a political concept, these sanctions. And now we have entered its 13th year, this war against Syria and the sanctions against the Syrian people. And that has impacted it in many ways, impacted the country in many ways, particularly economic development. And alongside the sanctions, certain factions were funded in order to destabilize the country and hamper any economic development. So this has led to a perilous situation. And that situation resulted in the impoverishment of the population and made the land more susceptible to colonization by the United States. And now its military bases in the region allowed it to interstitially occupy Syrian territories. In addition, the impoverishment of the Syrian people led to a deteriorating social cohesion, such that there are many deaths, a lot of people fleeing the country, and there's a demographic change happening in such that a lot of people migrate from northern parts of Syria, either because of the American occupation or the existence of terrorists that are supported by the United States. And so this has resulted in traumatic experiences for many people who live across Syria, that they feel traumatized, and now they are displaced and traumatized because of all of these unilateral decisions by the US. Furthermore, now there's even further corruption where people are capitalizing on this catastrophe, such that there's a few people getting so much wealth and most people are getting nothing out of it. There are people who are benefiting from this war. And this is a result of the proxy war against Syria and the Syrian people. And all of this is caused by the sanctions, and we cannot divorce the happenings in Syria from these unilateral decisions done by the United States. In terms of food and water, there's an insane amount of inflation that is that the normal citizen is carrying its brunt. These sanctions had also an implication on the education and on social services and many other sectors. And so even right now, there is a form of social lack of social cohesion, and especially with the changes of demographics and the proxy war and the destruction of a lot of the public services and institutions, such that there is a destruction of the Syrian morality. There's a lot of corruption happening in society, that because of people are trying to make ends meet by all means necessary. And so now Syrian people are divided. And this is part of the US hegemonic strategy in the region, is that to create a divided Syrian society, to reduce its ability to be proud of its history as of the history of the Syrian Arab Republic, which we all know that the history of Syria is very long and influential in the region. But then this project of US hegemony has targeted Syria for that particular reason, because of the positionality of Syria as a axis of resistance. The further destabilization and mass annihilation of populations and supporting separatist movements and funding illegal activities in the region is being done by the United States as well. Because of the sanctions and the proxy war, many of the Syrians sought an alternative lifestyle outside of Syria. Many of the doctors and the lawyers and the students, they cannot carry on their quotidian duties in Syria because of these sanctions, and so they were forced to flee the country. And so this is an intentional impoverishment of the whole population, especially with the financial sanctions that prevent any Syrian from transactions within Syria. This has prevented also the Syrian Syria's role in the Arab civilization in terms of medicine and history and the flow of ideas and knowledge with different entities. This has all been barred by the sanctions and the demonization of the Syrian people. For many of us, it's even difficult to even join on a Zoom call and have an international phone call unless if you come from a specific background or have specific access to these things. And now for children, it's becoming more difficult to even study because many of the schools were destroyed, and now even public transportation is more difficult for a lot of the students because right now the oil is being stolen, energy is being stolen by the United States, which has made it very difficult for anybody to use public transportation, especially that oil right now is extremely expensive and there's many sanctions on that sector. So now even these unilateral sanctions have been politicized in terms of a humanitarian aid. Right now, the regular citizen does not have access to liquidity, so they have to rely on food aid, medicine aid. And these sanctions make it even harder for that Syrian civilian to access these sources. Vaccines are becoming more difficult to access. Tumors, cancer, diabetes, all the medicines for these illnesses now cannot be accessed because of these illegal sanctions against Syria, the Syrian Arab Republic, imposed by the United States and its allies. So this is the daily lifestyle. Now, we used to have 24 million people in Syria. Now there are only 15 million exist in Syria. These sanctions were a reason for this mass migration. Furthermore, these sanctions led to the endless deaths of many sick people, children, women, pregnant women, the elderly, and this is part of the sanctions, is that they try to destroy the functions of the state, especially public services. In addition, the destruction ravaged by the war made it more difficult for agricultural productions, seed preservation, and so forth. None of these sectors are functional right now because of these sanctions. And this is considered to be a violation of international law. And it's evident that even when COVID-19 took place, we thought that potentially these sanctions were to be partly lifted at least, but no, the collective punishment continued. And it's good to mention that Syrian airplanes are not allowed to bring back Syrian civilians, citizens in different countries back to Syria because of sanctions on Syrian airplanes. They have been barred to travel back to Syria directly. So even the decision for Syria to try to bring back its citizens has been barred by the International Association of Air Travel. So these sanctions go even on, has implications on the demographic aspect of the Syrian society. And now the sovereignty of the legal sovereignty of the Syrian state has been obliterated, and particularly by the United States. And just to clarify, I'm not part of the ruling party, and I'm not employed by the state, and I'm not part of the body of any administration of the regime in the current regime of Syria. I'm just a regular citizen who lived in Syria and still lives in Syria, and I've never left Syria since 2011. I'm just a regular citizen and I have no political agenda. So I'm just telling these stories as a regular Syrian citizen who's still in Syria. And I say this because my stance is very clear and adamant. I don't want any other foreign entity to be infiltrating our country. We don't want any foreign intervention for any reason. And be it for 13 years, we have endured this aggression, and we waited, and we are patient, and we will continue to be patient. And we will continue to have this adamant stance that we don't want any foreign intervention against the Syrian people, especially that this intervention is illegal and violates international law. And now I'm speaking to you without electricity. Now I'm using my telephone, and I'm using my other telephone as a flashlight, and I'm trying to read the script that I have in front of me, and because we don't have electricity. So I'm using a flashlight, and that's it. And so this, right now, because we don't have fuel, we don't have electricity, we are back to Stone Ages because of these sanctions. So electricity is not even accessible easily now. So these sanctions prevent even the delivery of medicine to the Syrian people. A lot of labs and research institutes were forced to leave the country or lose funding and so forth because of these sanctions. Now, and the Red Crescent were functioning in northeastern Syria, which is now it cooperates with entities that are illegally existing on the Syrian territories. And now the Red Crescent is complicit in working with the Americans in stealing many of the seeds and the seed banks in that region. And the American occupation continues to support terrorist organizations and separatist organizations by funding them militarily and economically, logistically. And I want to reassert that Americans are occupying Syrian territories, and United States supports the so-called Islamic State or Daesh in the region. And they are enabling the expansion of those terrorists. And those terrorists also support the United States. And they both are occupying similar areas in northeast Syria. As for the pleas to lift the sanctions for humanitarian aid during the earthquake, we saw the inhumanity of the Americans when they prevented the delivery of aid to the public sector and for the needy and those who were ravaged by the catastrophic earthquake. And the sanctions were still imposed, which shows how inhumane these sanctions are. We always try to seek to help other people historically, and now we are at a situation where we are waiting for others to help us. But who is standing against this help? It's these unilateral sanctions. I want to add an important point. The existence of American organizations that are not allowed to enter the Syrian Arab Republic, particularly that these organizations, they have been barred to enter the Syrian territories. They have entered through the northeastern part, which is controlled by the U.S., which violates Syria's laws. And so, and it also is against the Syrian law to come into the country through that entrance, what's commonly called east of the Furat. A couple of days ago, there was there were American troops that went into a civilian area and kidnapped a number of youth, and this happened a few days ago. They were kidnapped by American troops, and now we don't know what's their fate. So there are Americans who kidnapped Syrian youth. We don't know what the consequence of or the situation of these people. The only reason that the Americans did that, they heard rumors that those particular youth were having a picture of Bashar al-Assad. And there's a video circulating that show the Americans are beating up one of these youth almost to death, and then the video stopped and as he was being dragged unconscious. We might not have enough time to speak about the crimes done by the sanctions and done by the unilateral sanctions by the United States because of how big they are and the American colonization of the Syrian territories. What I want to say, just one quick information. I'm part of the resistance that are legitimized by the international order. Resistance against the territories occupied by the American troops. I encourage the American people to pressure its government and its troops to leave Syria, because the only thing that we will be doing after these warnings is that we're going to return your kids, you Americans, in coffins back to America. So we will use all means necessary to defend ourselves, and this is a right that is guaranteed by international law for resistance. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for listening to my statement.
Dr. Hala, thank you so much. Shukran for your incredibly powerful testimony and for so generously giving us your time today. We really appreciate you. Thank you. Our next speaker and witness of the day is Dr. Adnan Azzouz. Dr. Adnan is the Dean of the Faculty of Literature and the head of the English department at Qasim University. He is the director of Middle East Office of the World Federation of Trade Unions and the senior advisor of General Federation of Trade Unions in Syria. Dr. Adnan, welcome and thank you so much for being with us. Whichever is easier for you would be.
Thank you. أود في البداية أن أشكركم جزيل الشكر على إتاحة هذه الفرصة لنا للتحدث اليوم وإبداء شهادتنا حول الأوضاع المأساوية التي يعاني منها العمال في سوريا نتيجة العقوبات المفروضة من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بحجة طبعا تغيير النظام في سوريا. البروباغندا
change in Syria. The massive propaganda conducted by the United States tries to create a sanctions regime on the Syrian people. So in order to destroy the Syrian people with a strategically. So the working class is the ones that are the most impoverished population. And so all the sanctions, they tend to, potentially other classes, they tend to potentially find other ways to circumvent sanctions. But the working class, they're the ones who face most of the pressure when it comes to these sanctions. So I'll do a quick overview of these sanctions and the implications on the working class, the workers, and also the general economy of Syrian Arab Republic. These sanctions that prevented the cooperation with the Central Bank of Syria, the Syrian Investment Bank, and also the transportation of any airplane equipment to the Syrian Republic. So these sanctions started like that. So the Syrian Arab Republic tried to be adaptable to these sanctions.
It seems like there is an issue with Dr. Adnan's connection. His connection completely dropped. Unfortunately, we can either wait a couple of more minutes to see if he can reconnect, or proceed with our next speaker and try to get him back, to just save time, because it's already almost 12. Okay, why don't we do Dr. Adnan? Dr. Adnan, can you hear me? We understand. Thank you so much, Dr. Adnan. No worries at all. Please continue, Dr. Adnan. We can hear you now.
Part of the sanctions, Syria needs to satisfy its internal needs in terms of oil and fuel. But because of the colonization and the occupation by the Americans, it's becoming more difficult for us to provide these services for the Syrian people. So the sanctions, in addition to the occupation, made it very difficult for us to provide these services for the Syrian people.
Yeah, unfortunately, the issue continues. Next time, I'm gonna ask him to perhaps turn off his camera. Maybe that'll help with the connection. It is really frustrating to just see in action how sanctions are designed to really make it difficult for the voices within Syria to be heard, quite literally. All right, so what I'm gonna do is introduce our next speaker, and in the meantime, we will try to get Dr. Adnan back. Okay, Dr. Bashir Mohammed is a consultant cardiologist and physician who graduated from Damascus University, and today will be joining us from London. Dr. Mohammed, thank you so much for being with us. Please go ahead.
Really, thank you very much for allowing this a chance for me to express my feeling, how much I am frustrated from the policies done by the West and by America against my country. I think the medical issue, I will cover the medical issue, but it is part of whole wider range of damage and harm. Let me just go to make it a few steps quickly to say the sanction of the United States and the West started from the 70s, as my colleagues, my comrades mentioned. It started in 70s, 80s was economic and technology, in the 2000 and above diplomatic and financial and banking, and then sanction against petrol, or in brackets, stealing petrol. This has affected the country in a very difficult situation. Now, I would like to mention that 2011, when we have suffered what my colleagues said, the hybrid or the proxy war against the country, till that date, the sanction against Syria have been for decades before that in all aspects of life by the West and by United States, including also Australia and Canada. Even with those sanctions, the country was able to cope and was with no debt, stable economy, good agriculture and trade and industry. There was a free education from the beginning to the end. my university's fees were zero, few pounds every year. I finished the secondary school, the university. I had the all qualifications. I didn't pay any penny. Only my what I was spending for living. There was a free medical health care, free training for the doctors, the medical students, and the nursing. The pharmaceutical factories were able to supply medication for most of the needs of the country and transport and sell medication for 47 countries. At that time, we had good medical services everywhere in Syria, and so many countries used to come to have treatment and management in the country, including IVF, including heart surgery. I was working in the specialist center in Damascus, and from all surrounding countries, people came to have treatment for angiogram and angioplasty. There we had at that time specialist hospitals and centers for ophthalmology, for interventional cardiology, for heart surgeries, for dialysis, for pregnancies and children and babies. We have excellent children hospital in Damascus, and now too many in all around the country. Now, starting in March 2011, there was a trouble in the country. No matter what is the reason, differences, opposition and the government, or the reason, we found straight away that there was siege and sanction came from the West and became more, already they were there, but they became more strict and more tight. Now fighters, in brackets, came or were recruited from about 100 countries, supported logistically by American and West intelligence and media, supported by Turkey, financed by the Gulf. And this made pressure on the demand, including the medical services, which was affected by the military burden, because we have military, we have army defending the country, defending the borders, defending the security of the people, and they will need demand. So they will need demand for money will be reflected negatively in some financial support to the medical health and services. Now, number one, this increased the pressure on the medical services because we have injured, we have people who have suffered from the war. And there was damage of so many medical services, attacked national hospitals. One example, in Homs, they attacked the national hospital and they hanged the nurses. When they left the hospital, they found nurses hanged. They attacked Adra and they burned a doctor in the furnace. They attacked and destroyed all pharmaceutical factories in Al-Ghouta and in Damascus suburbs. The doctors were assassinated. Dr. Haytham Al-Yunis, Dr. Maida Yusuf, Dr. Isa Al-Kuli, my colleague, was assassinated in front of his house, in front of his children. Deprived the country from improving medical instruments and spare pieces. So some instruments became not working, including CT scan and echo machines and MRI scan. I think the situation become more devastated when we had the COVID to add extra pain and suffering. And to my close relatives, I lost about 3 of my colleagues or my relatives, doctors, from COVID. I remember 100 tens, let me say dozens of doctors were lost their lives. Why? We don't have enough protection. We don't have enough support. We don't have enough. We can't import. We can't supply enough protection. So in COVID, sanction deprived the country from buying treatments, antivirals, vaccinations, masks. Thousands of lives were lost. Many of them are doctors. I'm talking about the doctors specifically and the nurses. And large number of the doctors were unable to do the job in those circumstances. I think if we talk about COVID, too much to say, but at least we can say that we couldn't offer vaccination for everybody like we have in the Western countries, which we have the right. And I'm sure the government is keen to offer this protection and this vaccination. Now, in this regard, we can say from 110 hospitals, 26 hospitals were not working. And for medical centers, 34% of the hospitals not working and 20 are working partially. As we know, the most vulnerable part was the children and the pregnant women. Too much to say about that. We suffered lack of energy. And if we talk about energy, I'm sure you know that we have blocked everything. We need heating, we need energy for everywhere. We need electricity. And you see the electricity, how it is the situation. So the lack of energy made the life very difficult. Don't ask about cold for the community and lack of heating, and this will make infections. Lack of what we call it, lack of supply of food and drink, and lack of what we call it, of all needs. Now, if we go to the earthquake after that, this is another disaster above disaster. In all Syria, there was massive need for help, need for hands to help and to save the lives, machines, instruments, logistics. We need expertise to deal with earthquake, how to save lives and how to deal with cases like rhabdomyolysis and distress. Let me, before saying distress, about amputations, about distress, especially in the children. I mean, all Syria, likewise Turkey, suffered the same way, and we lost 6,000 lives in Syria, and thousands of families left their houses or stayed without houses, and millions were affected. And the help came to Turkey and nothing came to Syria, which is something unbelievable. And this can apply for the social, for the food, and for the medical issue. So the system was already exhausted with war for the last 12 years. Came after that the COVID. So we have lack of resources, lack of fuel, lack of machinery and technology and medication and hospitals and food and shelters and accommodation. Unfortunately, Western countries haven't helped, of course, including the United States, haven't helped and haven't allowed the help to arrive. Increased demand on health system, increased difficulty, increased pressure on medical centers, on clinics, admission, surgeries. Unusual cases like rhabdomyolysis and amputations. We don't have all the expertise for every doctor to deal with it. Medications, lack of medications, lack of emotional support, spread of infection and diseases, lack of protection, lack of prophylaxis and vaccination, reduced number of medical centers and hospitals and equipments and staff. So we have about 20,000 children less than 5 years have difficulty and malnutrition. This is estimated. I think the numbers are even more, and complications of the malnutrition. I can give you imagination of father and mother lost their house, lost their resources. They are already poor, not having enough food and clean water, exhausted already, standing watching their suffering child with the chest infection, with poor nutrition, or with the bloody diarrhea and poor nutrition. He is at risk of death. And we have lack of medication, lack of tools, and lack of the doctors who some of them died from COVID, and some have gone out of the country, and some are exhausted already. What is their feeling? How do they feel? Can anybody imagine the situation? I don't know really. How do the West and the United States do think? How they do their brains work? I think the government, I'm not part of this government, which I respect what they have done so far. They are trying to cope with all those disasters, and they are doing everything possible to help people. And of course, the Syrians are trying to help from all directions, all sides of the world. But we are not allowed. They don't allow money to move there. They don't allow us to send any medical instruments. I think what we can say all together, we have damage has affected the hospitals, the medical centers, the ambulances, the clinics, surgeries, private clinics, instruments, pharmacies. We have lack of raw materials. Today I spoke to my colleague back home. Raw materials to make them, to manufacture medications or baby milk. Buying those instruments, if we can bypass the sanctions, they are very costly and they need dollars. And you can imagine really there is need for help by all means. We need help from all directions, for everything, for medicals, for instruments, for, let me say, for contrast material, for anesthesia, for CT scans, and we need spare pieces and repair. And all together will make us standing carefully and say, sanction is disaster against this medical service in our country, which is unfair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bashir, for this insightful testimony and sharing with us some of the most horrifying, inhumane impacts of sanction on the country. I'd like to try again with Dr. Adnan. Dr. Adnan, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you perfectly.
Wonderful. Please go ahead.
Shall I continue where I stopped, or shall I start over?
If you can just a very quick recap of where you started and then continue, that will be wonderful.
Yes. I'm going to okay. سوف أقوم بمتابعة ما تحدثت عنه.
So first I would like to apologize for the interruption because of things that I cannot control, electricity.
مشترك. ووفقا للسيناريو الاستمراري الذي وضعته الخطة الخمسية 11 فإن إجمالي المشتغلين كان سيصل إلى نحو 6 ملايين، أي أن الحرب والعقوبات تسببت في فقدان 3 مليون.
Since the sanctions were imposed, there have been roughly 6 million people who lost their jobs, which is now the GDP reduced from 60 billion to 30 billion. And now also the unemployment increased from 12% before the war. Now it's 38% in 2019. So when the sanctions, this is from the beginning of the sanctions to now, to 2019, that is 38%. Economic indicators show that 3.2 million citizens have lost their jobs, and 48% right now in 2023 are unemployed. 4% of the population is are below poverty level. The economic sanctions reduced from the exports of the part of the GDP from 62% to 40%. And these problems proliferated even further and destroyed the private sector, the public sector, and any small businesses. And so job prospects for the working class have been completely destroyed. And so most of the working class and also the middle class have been impoverished and rather they live below poverty. The sanctions also made it difficult for the private sector to carry on its manufacturing and any kind of production, which has resulted in further firing and dismissing of workers. And so even before, 75% of the employed people were working in the private sector. And so now 1.6 million people, because of the private sections facing so many sanctions, 1.6 million people have lost their jobs. And so there are roughly so far 400,000 institutions, be it a building, private and public, have been destroyed by the war and also by the sanctions. So because of the lack of the repairs or because of the war. And so the economy is incapable of producing new jobs. And so even further, the sanctions have reduced the size of Syria's foreign investments. And the sanctions imposed on the Syrian banking sector, particularly the Central Bank of Syria and its foreign investments, that were contributing to creating new jobs and expanding the size of the labor force. These sanctions froze these projects, and as a consequence, a lot of people lost their jobs. The land blockade with neighboring countries because of the sanctions also had a consequence. And now the air travel that is, led to massive losses in terms of labor force, but also in terms of humanitarian, and which has been discussed already by other testimonies. In terms of production of medicine has also diminished. Now, even because of the inflation and the currency exchange rate, have made it even more difficult to import medicine, even after circumventing the sanctions, if possible. COVID as well had a negative impact because of due to the sanctions, Syrians were unable to store medicines that help mitigate the pandemic. Furthermore, the grain situation in the Russian-Ukrainian war has also had a negative impact on Syria. Whereas before we used to be self-reliant, right now we rely on importing that. Now, when it comes to foreign aid to Syria, more entities are susceptible to provide aid to the Syrian people because of the presence of so-called terrorists in certain areas. Now, because of the sanctions and because of the private sector incapable of producing any new job prospects, many of the unemployed were forced to join these movements. And so the sanctions have a role in the destruction of the Syrian society. And now when it comes to the exchange rate, it's also made it more difficult for Syrian to contribute to any economics of supply and demand and international transactions. Now, primary resources that Syria used to import in order to manufacture medicine and products inland it's becoming really difficult. Now, roughly 7 million people cannot make a living because of these sanctions, particularly because they work in these sectors that produce these final products after importing the primary products. So the Syrian state right now focused on internal investment in terms of infrastructure and so forth. So now, because of the sanctions, a lot of the money made it more difficult for us to track where the money is. It's more difficult for the state to buy in foreign exchange certain goods and services. And so Syria has been isolated in that sense. Many of the economic institutions were impacted, particularly the agricultural sector. So even even the number of the arable land right now has been reduced because of the theft of water and the lack of seeds. And so wheat production, corn production, and many other agricultural productions have, in terms of mass and land mass, have been reduced because of these sanctions. And so now cotton production, for example, has been reduced by 47% because of the sanctions. Now, food security also it was impacted, and so for a lot of people cannot access food and water, and so in terms of food production, and as a collective, we used to have reserves of 12 billion tons, and now it's 9 only. And so now many of the arable lands are out of the control of the Syrian people. Like Dr. Hada mentioned earlier, many of the territories are occupied by foreign entities, which deter the ability of the Syrian people to access those sources. And so we as the Association of Workers, we try to create multiple campaigns that educate people about the impact of sanctions. And so we worked with people in Cyprus, for example, with the International Association of Workers, to highlight that the impact of the sanctions on the working class in Syria, and highlighted how sanctions impact any possibility for working class people to make a living. And so these working class people are trying to find jobs. And many people in Europe and the US, they always say that we have so many migrating people from Syria. This problem is very easy to solve. These Syrians, if they have job opportunities in their own countries, they wouldn't be leaving. These sanctions force Syrian people to migrate because there are no jobs available due to the sanctions itself. These youth are seeking jobs outside of Syria because of the economic situation. And the economic situation is bad because of the sanctions. And so that's why they migrate. And now that we live in this situation of lack of oil, gas, wheat, electricity, the West, they're always lying and crying about the fact that there's so many migrating from Syria to Europe, and they completely neglect the fact that the root cause of this problem is Europe and the United States. Try to lift the sanctions, try to allow the working class people to have working opportunities in Syria, as opposed to impose sanctions on us. And so they always talk about these training campaigns for Syrians in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Germany, and so to help them reintegrate back to the Syrian society. Why don't you make these training campaigns, these workers who fled Syria and now being trained elsewhere, why don't you do the trainings inside Syria? So that way they don't need to leave the country. Now, after the control of the most of the territories of Syria, we need a massive reconstruction plan. And we need the Syrian people to come back and work in Syria for the development of Syria. And so these sanctions and this drain of workers from Syria to Europe is not contributing to the development of Syria. And so this is an economic war on the working class of Syria. And so we say, lifting the sanctions, which is very essential, which is not a part of a propaganda, and we're trying to use the earthquake as something to lift the sanctions. No, we want the lifting of sanctions because these international companies, we want them to come back to Syria and start working for the development of Syria. We want China, for example, to come and help in the development of Syria. But now, because of the sanctions, everybody is afraid to work with Syrians because of the sanctions on Syria. Everybody is crying about the civilians dying because of the sanctions, and not understanding that sanctions have an important role in the death of the Syrian people. So this terrorist war imposed on Syria and the earthquake, in addition to the sanctions, they are deteriorating the living conditions of the working class of Syria. And so whatever there's an opportunity for the Syrian government and the Syrian state to protect civilians and develop the economy, it has been barred by these sanctions. And so the simple question is, you can easily improve the situation in Syria by removing the sanctions, and then you will see how the situation will get better. And I apologize for speaking at length, and thank you so much for your time, and I apologize for the cuts. And I'm glad that the internet worked right now. Thank you so much for your time.
We are too. Thank you so much, Dr. Adnan, for providing this incredibly powerful testimony on the impact of sanctions on the workers, which is not very often talked about, and the displacement of many workers and citizens of Syria as a result of this. Thank you so much. I'm gonna go right ahead and introduce Johnny Achi, who is a Syrian expatriate, a US graduate in electrical engineering, and a co-founding member of Arab Americans for Syria. Johnny led many fact-finding missions to Syria since 2011, and he's a frequent public speaker on Syria for consideration of the Syrian viewpoints and for humanitarian assistance for Syrians damaged by war, economic sanctions, and occupation of Syrian territory by the United States, Israel, and Turkey. Johnny, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all the speakers before me. You covered amazing amount of information that was really needed. I would stick a little bit to what I know about, which is the political aspect of why we're here today. I've heard some of you said in 2011 we started for whatever reason it started. It's important to talk about the reasons because we wouldn't be able to solve the solution if we don't know the roots of the problem. The problem didn't even start at 2011. As Dr. Lloyd mentioned, that 1979, Syria was put by the US under sanctions because it was considered to be a terrorism sponsoring state. terrorism sponsoring state since 1979 for supporting, obviously, the Palestinian right to homeland, the Palestinian right actually to their own homeland. We were supporting them to have the right to go back home. And for that, we were placed on that. By the way, this is yearly vote. And they just voted 2 weeks ago to, again, extend the sanctions. So it's a yearly extension that happened since 1979. And unfortunately, there was a group of so-called Syrian expatriates who were on Capitol Hill. And I think some of you saw that video, went viral. A dozen of who they call themselves Syrians. In my world, they are more or less pawns or puppet for the American militarism. These are the people who called for the bombing of Syria on the first week of the crisis. These people are not true Syrians. True Syrians are people who are here on this call, Syrians who are in Syria. They know how to speak about Syria, but that sanction was again voted unanimously, 430 versus only 2 votes. So these sanctions are not new to us. We've lived through it. As most of you mentioned, we learned how to cope with it. We still were self-sufficient. Just before the crisis in 2011, Syria was living its best days when the rest of the world was living a financial crisis. My brother moved backward, and I was going to migrate backward. He moved backward with his American family, not just his wife. The life in Syria was so great. That did not go too well for them. Now, we know Syria is under pressure. We know you all also seen the video by General Wesley Clark's back right after 9/11, when they did mention that there is a memo to not just intervene, but destroy the government of 7 countries. This is very important to know that the Pentagon had on his, the plan is to destroy the government of 7 countries. And those 7 countries were Iraq, which they did, Somalia and Sudan, which they destabilized, Lebanon, a couple times in 2006. And then it was left Libya, Syria, and then Iran. In 2011, when what happened in Libya was the most ridiculous. There was really no pretext. The only pretext they were able to find, and it's crazy to even believe, I don't know which PR firm put that pretext in front of the US government, that Muammar Gaddafi is giving Viagra to his army to go and rape every woman in Libya. That is ridiculous that this pretext was discussed in United Nations. In Iraq, we know weapons of mass destruction. And after this government fell and these countries were destroyed, they come out and say, yes, that was a lie. They admit it was a lie. But they needed to, at the moment, to build reason. So in Syria, we've heard of all the pretexts since 2011, the massacres that happened, always on the eve of United Nations resolution. I mean, that Syrian army must be so dumb that every time we have an opening for us to speak about what's happening in Syria, something monstrous happened every time. We've seen how we were called, unluckily for some of the vetoes that happened, but we were en route to be destroyed like Libya was in a few months. Libya, till today, tens of thousands lost their lives. Muammar Gaddafi is gone. One of the richest per capita in Africa to the poorest right now, most destabilized. That is the work of the imperialist United States for a lie, a simple lie. So Syrians knew what was coming to them. And that is why Syrians fought this new exported democracy and exported freedom that the United States wants to export to us. We said, thank you, but no thank you. It's important for us to continue to raise that, because I just came yesterday from a Washington, D.C. trip to the White House regarding, it was the 20th anniversary of the Iraq war, of course, and there's still no war criminals. 2 million Iraqis lost their life, and Bush was actually nominated for a Peace Nobel Award. Obama got a Nobel Peace. So all these war criminals get Nobel Award for Peace versus 2 million Iraqis lost their lives. And we were in Washington, D.C., and I was surprised. Some people still don't know the truth about Syria because the propaganda machine is still going, because Syria is still standing tall. They're not done with us. We're talking about sanctions, but it's way beyond that. If Syria would kneel, if Syria would bow, to the imperialist demands, which is let the IMF and the World Bank finance the reconstruction of Syria today, and tomorrow will be the end of sanctions. They want us to be slaves to the IMF and the World Bank, just like every country in the world is. That's what the deep state goal is. When Syria survived and was self-sufficient, she owed no single dollar to the IMF and the World Banks. And that's what you have to keep thinking. The deep state today will say, I'm going to lend you trillions of dollars. I'm going to go build your country, but forever you'll be a slave. You'll be my slave. Syria refused, because Syria, the cradle of civilization, teaches the world how to be civilized. We don't need a 200-year-old empire to teach us what we need to know. Empires comes and goes. Civilizations don't. Okay, so keep in mind, it's an ongoing. Educate your surroundings about why Syria is into this. Tell them about two things. Americans and the Gulf state intervened in Syria from day one. Why were they paying all this money for people in the army to defect? If this was a spontaneous revolution, why would you pay? And this is Hamad bin Jassim, and it's a very recent interview, and I recommend that you all look for it. It's kind of hard to find on YouTube, just like million things disappeared from YouTube and Google, and this is another war they're fighting against us. I lost over 3,800 of crimes against humanity that I collected throughout. My YouTube channel disappeared, and so many other YouTube channels disappeared. But let's just stay the focus. The two things I need you to concentrate on is Hamad bin Jassim latest interview said we paid $15,000 for the smallest little army guy, meaning if someone with no high school just barely entered the army, $15,000. Now we know they were paying him, but we didn't know the amount, as long as they show up on Jazeera the next day. Any low-ranking officer, 30 grand, and went all the way to 500,000 for high generals. And we all know what Riyadh Hijab got from the Saudi Arabia, by the words of Hamad bin Jassim, $50 million US. So if they had to pay $2 trillion, that's Hamad bin Jassim, spent $2 trillion first year to force a revolution on the Syrian people. And with that, they could not have enough fuel, human fuel, to fuel the fight. So they went to backup plan. And this backup plan is backed up by the CIA. Bring jihadists and mercenaries from all over the world. And one of you said 100 countries. To be exact, it's 84 countries. Dr. Bashar al-Jafari took 84 nationalities with their IDs to United Nations, saying, hold on, we're being invaded by 84 nationalities, mercenaries. Why? Because some clergymen, some clerics in Saudi Arabia called a holy war, a fatwa. A fatwa is a religious decree. It's almost like an order from God to go fight a holy war against the infidels in Syria. We Syrians became infidels, and it was okay for all the jihadists and the mercenaries who are responding to a fatwa, to come in and butcher us. And it was not okay for the Syrian army to fight back, because the United States told you there is no extremists, they're all moderate rebels. And who they were sponsored by the United States. In the same interview, Hamad bin Jassim talked about al-Farisa, or the prey. We were going after the prey. So he's admitting there was a prey. But what he said is, and how the prey got away, is because every nation wanted a piece of that prey. Because the biggest prey is Syria. And if Syria fell, Iran is failing. And now the World Bank and the world order comes to the United States, and they become the true empire of the world. So when Hamad said money was paid by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and weapons were entered through Turkey, he's telling you details. All the money was paid, financed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and weapons were entered with the cooperation of the CIA. Those heavy artillery were not dropped from the sky. They were entered. So there was a plan to destabilize Syria. So we have to, when we say it's a proxy war, don't laugh at us. Don't call us Assadists. When we say it's a regime change war, it is. Otherwise, why the whole world was intervening in it? 7, 8 nations were fighting for Syria. They call them the Paris opposition, if you remember back in the days. There was a Paris opposition, there was a Washington opposition, there was a London opposition, obviously there was Istanbul opposition, and the Doha and the Riyadh opposition. When we go to peace talk, Syrian government was not invited. Those 6 other oppositions were invited, and they couldn't agree among each other because they wanted piece of the action. They wanted to be the ruling party when things fell apart. The same 6 were financing their different fractions on the ground. We have to know those billions and hundreds of billions were spent to each financing their own. We know there was the Riyadh factions fighting on the ground, whether it's al-Nusra, whether it's al-Qaeda, whether it's Ahrar al-Sham, everybody, Turkey had its own, even Israel had their own factions. When these factions fought together, that's how the prey got away, and that's what Hamad bin Jassim. Take their word, don't take my word. Take the word of the LA Times. If I can show you LA Times on September 2016, March 27, 2016, in Syria, militias armed by the CIA is fighting the militia armed by the Pentagon. I don't know if you can see this, but take my word for it. LA Times is saying in Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fighting those armed by the CIA. If US has two different militias in Syria fighting each other, one armed by the Pentagon, just think what Syrians had to come through, and think what the Syrian army and the nearly 100,000 of lives that they sacrificed to defend us from all these militias. And then we were told we had no right to defend us. And they start using the gas and the sarin. And we all know who sarin it is. Ask Seymour Hersh. He exposed the lies in a very great article. You need to learn. You need to educate your people when they tell you, you guys, your own people, you killed your own people. Tell them, no, we were killing mercenaries. We saved the world from the mercenaries of ever you having to fight them back again. Okay, so we know, we know the war happened. We know we survived it. We know, but we can't declare victory. We can't just say we're done, because the war now is a soft war. These economic sanctions, and I don't call it economic sanctions. My message is to the world now to end the siege on Syria. We went to Washington, D.C. yesterday. We were worrying end the siege on Syria, because we have occupation. We have illegal presence of a U.S. army on the ground in Syria, which making things 10 times more difficult. When they occupy 1/3 of the territory that has 2/3 of the natural resources of the land, the wheat, the cotton, the oil is all east and northeast of Syria. They control that. They're looting. They're stealing all that and sending it to the northern Iraq, to the Kurdistan area, where they can, sell it there. Syrian population not only living under sanction, but they can't even get a hold of their own resources. So this is what we're calling it a siege. They're trying to literally suffocate the Syrian population, and Syrians are tired. Yesterday in the rally, I didn't see too many Syrians, unfortunately, which was very painful to see all these Americans, close to 2,000 people coming and speaking, but Syrians are tired. But we can't be tired. This is what exactly is wanting us. They want the soft war. They couldn't win the hard war. They couldn't win with weapon and mercenaries. We defeated them, yes, but now we have a soft war that needs a lot more patience than before. So what we're asking you as Americans, call. You have to teach people how to call their representative. That worked in 2013. I was in Damascus when this Eastern Ghouta attack happened. I was in Damascus. We were welcoming the United Nations team with Carla Del Ponte on August 20th, after 4 months of waiting for them to come investigate the bombing in Khan al-Ansal of sarin gas that we knew 100% it was projected from the terrorist held territories. Finally, that team comes in, and the next morning we get another attack of sarin gas. Think about who's benefiting from all this evil act. You know who the culprit is. But immediately they said, they pinned us on the Syrian army one more time, and now a war. There was a drums of war in 2013. I was in Damascus. We brought a huge delegation of Americans to help us out. The point I'm trying to make, my friends, is we called by New York Times, 4 million calls and emails. They flooded the congressmen. Some congresspeople were saying, our phone lines are melting. We will not vote for war on Syria. Stop calling. How do I know that? New York Times contacted me in Damascus. I still till today don't know how they got my Syrian cell phone number. I guess that journalist had dual role, maybe a CIA role and a journalism role, but he got me and he said, can you speak? I said, only if you put the link for my Facebook page, No War on Syria. He said he would, and he did. He said millions and millions of people call. So when the people mobilize, we win. We can't just have speeches. We need to talk to our surrounding, encourage them to call their representative. People will respond. That removal of sanction is a joke. It's not a removal of sanction. You all know that an exception on General License 23 did not change anything. But because they got so many calls, they were obligated to do something. They fooled us because they killed the momentum, but they didn't give us anything. General License 23 didn't change anything. We still cannot send any money, any equipment, any medical help, any food, nothing. Nothing has changed, but they kind of killed the momentum a little bit. I assure you, please help the Syrian people. They don't need handouts. They don't need donations. They need your help. They deserve your help. They won. They defeated the imperialist West. They defeated the empire. They dared to win, but they did win. Help them in their struggle. They need you more than ever. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for this powerful testimony and for allowing us to even better understand the important role that Syria is playing in resistance in the region, and which is precisely why it is being targeted the way it is, and for reminding us our job in the belly of the beast and at the heart of the empire is to educate ourselves and to unlearn a lot of narratives that we've been fed over the years. And to resist them and call them out. And we hope that this tribunal is a small contribution to this. I'm going to before I turn the floor to Nina for the Q&A session of this hearing, I'd like to extend our gratitude to our incredible witnesses today, as well as our translators, Assam and Ali, who did a wonderful job for making sure that the hearing is accessible in both languages. We are truly enriched by all of your presentations today. Thank you so much. Nina John, all yours.
Thank you very much, Helia John, and I echo Helia's gratitude to the speakers and the translators. It was an excellent session. We have about 40 minutes for discussion and question and answer. I just want to add, for people who don't know in the audience, prior to the U.S. invasion of Syria, it was regarded as one of the most culturally rich and intellectually advanced countries in the region. And women in particular, the state of women in particular in Syria was respected across the region. And just in 10 years, the US and Europe have destroyed all that. So I just wanted to note that because people don't know. So I'm going to open it up now to the jurors for question and answer. The jurors we have on board today are Jaribu Hill, Michael Deutsch, Charlotte Cates, Mohammed Tay, and Victor Good. And if you'd like to, I'm not going to read their bios. If you'd like to get to know them, you can go to our website, which has been posted in the chat box, to see their bios. What I'm going to do is just call on the jurors individually to see if they have any questions for the witnesses, rather than wait for folks' hands to go up. If you do not have a question, that's totally fine. And then at the end of the question and answer, I will ask the jurors, especially those of you that have participated in several of the hearings thus far, if you have any reflections to offer us. Just 2 to 3 minutes of reflections, nothing too serious. For the audience, we'd like to let you know that we are going on break for the next about a little bit less than 4 weeks. Ramadan begins soon, and many of our countries and many of our witnesses practice. And so we're going to go on break to respect them. Our next hearing will be in about 4 weeks, Friday, April 14th on Sudan. And the hearing after that will be the Iran hearing. So please, if you're interested in signing up, please go to the website and you can sign up there. But enjoy the transition to spring, and we'll see you on the other side. So with that, let's get to it. Jaribu, do you have any questions for the witnesses?
Yes, thank you, Nina, and solidarity and revolutionary greetings to all of my comrades on the screen, especially those who are in the war-torn, sanctioned areas. We feel your pain in Mississippi. We are in the belly of the beast for sure. And I wanted to direct my questions coming from the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights. I wanted to direct my question regarding trade union solidarity to my brother Adnan, who spoke at length about the work that has been done with regard to mobilizing workers, mobilizing the working class, and centering the working class. And so I wanted to ask, I know the answer, but I have to ask, what has been the relationship, if any, to the American trade union movement or the U.S. trade union movement, especially with regard to the AFL-CIO? I know that decades ago, there was solidarity. There were solidarity actions from trying to decolonize South Africa to addressing the struggles in the Middle East, Palestinian solidarity, and so forth. What do we have now in terms of the AFL-CIO? And the second part of my question is going to always be on every tribunal hearing that I attend, I'm going to be asking for names of corporations, banking institutions that are financed by the United States, because we need to target those entities for the suffering that they're sponsoring. So those are my two questions: trade union mobilization and solidarity, and corporate accountability.
Thank you very much, Jaribu. This question was for Dr. Adnan. Are you with us?
Yes, yes.
Great, go ahead.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
hear you. Sorry?
Go ahead, Dr. Adnan.
Miss Nina, I didn't hear the question. Would you please repeat?
Yes, I can repeat the first part. So the first part was regarding trade union, the whether there is trade union solidarity from the trade unions located in the U.S. and specifically, Jaribu mentioned the AFL-CIO because of their relationship with the CIA, currently their relationship with the CIA. But what is the relationship between trade unions in the United States and trade unions in your part of the world?
Actually, there is no relationship between GFTV Syria and any trade unions in the United States, except for one union in USA, which is affiliated to World Federation of Trade Unions, which is a lifted branch of unions, because all trade unions in the United States are of what we call, as you know, it is funded and by CIA and other agencies. So we don't have this relation with them.
Okay.
Yes, Ms. Tina.
Okay.
Okay. Could I just follow up, please?
Yes. Yes. Go ahead, Jerry.
So I would be really remiss if I didn't say that yes, we do have those mercenary forces backed by and financed by the CIA, but we also have genuine working class forces and a history of resistance and a history of solidarity. So I would urge us to be intentional about identifying points of entry for those types of solidarity actions. And I'm certainly not speaking for the AFL-CIO, which we have nicknamed AFL-CIA, but there are other forces that are, particularly if you look at the history of the longshoremen's unions and how they blocked the ports in solidarity with our struggle against colonialism in South Africa, and how supportive they've been regarding the struggles of Palestinian people as well. So I would urge us to really try to find those points of entry that are not connected to our enemies. And my other question was to identify corporations and banks that are specifically US born or US sponsored that we can target as we continue to do solidarity work and hold these corporations accountable for the misery and the suffering and the genocide that they're responsible for.
Thank you, Juribu. Can anybody answer the second question about specific banks and financial institutions that we can target? This is actually a really excellent and important question.
I think Mohammed Tay has his hand up. I think he wants to answer, maybe.
No, Dr. Tay is a juror, so he's going to be the next juror that's asking questions. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, if there are no answers to this question, Juribu,
I can list a couple of quick corporations that I think people might be interested in looking up. As far as the specific issue of the theft of Syrian oil, if you look at Delta Crescent Energy, this was a major donor to Republican Party causes. It was founded by U.S. Army Delta Force veteran James Reese. And then it was also co-founded by former Gulf Sands Petroleum executive John P. Dorrier Jr. And then also the private security firm Tiger Swan, which is helping to protect these theft operations going on in Syria. They had contracts for a long time. I don't know their current presence, but definitely a couple of years ago they were there. And they also play a very reactionary role, of course, in the United States, because Tiger Swan was a major repression mechanism against, if you remember, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests against the Native movement there. So just a couple of corporations that come to mind immediately.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick. Dr. Tay, Dr. Mohammed, can we move to you now? Do you have any questions for the jurors, for the witnesses?
Really, for the time being, just to mention nothing
نعم
specific.
لدي عدد من الأسئلة. أولاً
Yes, I have a number of questions that I would like to state. And there were many testimonies that were eye-opening, and many of them even provided statistics and numbers which really document the crimes of these sanctions. So one of my questions, what role does Northeast Syria have in terms of agricultural and oil production? Do we have statistics? Do we have statistics about those who have died due to COVID and cholera that spread recently? Do we have statistics about that? And then if Americans are supporting ISIS, as has been reported, does the United States have the right to carry operations, or does Islamic State, Daesh, does the operations after getting the green light from the Americans? So is Daesh a function of the US process? Is there a clear cooperation between the two? Now, when it comes to if troops are being controlled by the United States, does the United States give them direct commands, and are they complete obeying them? And now, what is the Syrian people's stance on American occupation of Syrian territory? Is there a clear position that is political, social, that really delineates that the occupation is happening or they're standing against it? So is there a public discourse coming from the Syrian people against this? And now, in terms of the destruction of historic and heritage sites, does the United States have a role in that destruction? And thank you.
I would like to answer the part about the United States and ISIS, and I leave the agricultural percentages and the other part of the question someone else. It's very important that we realize that Mr. Tay, in 2014, in September 2014, when Obama, can you hear me, Mr. Tay? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. When Obama decided he wants to go to Syria.
أسمعك. تفضل.
Now, this is important point, really important. Remember, for 4 years, beginning from 2011 to 2014, the United States told the world that there's no terrorist in Syria, there's no radical, there's no extremist. It's only moderate rebels, and Syrian is killing its own people. When ISIS in 2014, they're starting to lose some ground. I mean, they went from 30 to 25% of that because of different factions on the ground. United States decided, and for the killing of one journalist, American journalist, Obama decided to create a coalition of 10 countries to go fight ISIS, because ISIS today is a big threat to the United States. So ISIS in Syria is a big threat to the United States that is 10,000 miles away. But it wasn't a threat for the Syrian population. Keep that in mind. So the coalition was made by United States, France, Britain, Canada, Australia, and a couple more European countries, and then Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. These are the 10 countries that created the coalition to go fight ISIS. Most of these are financiers of the world on Syria, and most of them are direct financiers to the ISIS on Syria. What happened in 1 year? More infrastructure of Syrian civilians were killed. And this is the only time that the U.S. actually media did talk about 300 civilians killed by U.S. Bombing and Deir ez-Zor, if you remember. Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa got a lot of hits, but it was a lot of collateral. They call it collateral damage. Syrian posts, military Syrian posts were hit, collateral damage. But the hundreds of armored vehicles and forerunners driving in the deserts could not be a target to Obama. In 1 year, ISIS grew its territory to double in size. And that is why in 2015, the Syrian government asked the help from Russia. And when Russia came in the first 3 weeks of the Russian campaign, 50% of ISIS infrastructure was destroyed. So the United States did not go into Syria. They just wanted intervention, another pretext for intervention. They are created these monsters. They need them to use them different places. So they're in direct contact with them. Now they tell them to take a hit, or they might, give them a hit, but they're gonna always use them. They're still using him, as Dr. Hala mentioned, what happened in the Tanaf area. These are the mercenaries. Call them ISIS, call them Nusra, call them moderate rebels. They are the proxy fighters of the United States on the ground in Syria. They need them, they have them, they still exist. So let's not kid yourself. The United States never carried the coalition to fight ISIS. It's the Syrian army with the help of their friends and the Russians and others who defeated ISIS. So they're still existing in pockets, but they still take orders directly from the United States, to answer that question specifically. Thank you.
And they are hiding in their bases. Yes.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Tay had a couple of other questions. He asked for statistics on COVID and cholera, agriculture and oil. He asked a question about Syrian, the position of the people, and then also on historical.
So yes, COVID really, yeah. I will forward some details in numbers, but what I can tell about COVID damage, Syria had lost 130 doctors in the COVID endemic. This is not to mention the number of the nurses and not to mention the number of patients. Yeah. But what other question do you want to me to answer if I know the details about that?
Of the position of the Syrian people with regard to U.S. intervention in the U.S.
يعني
presence?
إذا تقديرات أولا ثم أنه لي تمني أن تمدوا المحكمة بما لديكم من وثائق حول ما
You have any documents that prove all of these statements that you just mentioned? So if something like this could be provided to a court, like do you have any testimonies, or sources, authentic ones? And now in terms of numbers, and I understand that Syria might be a context where it's difficult to get statistics, and so, but I think any statistic would be just useful to gather
Carefully and mention the number. I didn't go too much in detail in numbers in order just to really have a general view about the whole matter. The situation is very large, and it involves all aspects of medical practice, including the laboratories, including the x-rays, including the practice, the hospitals, and so on, treatment of cancers and diabetes and everything. So the matter has taken the maximum effect, but I will provide the court with all the details about those matters. Promise, yes, soon, yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bashir. Can anybody speak to historical sites, agriculture and oil, or the position of the Syrian people? Dr. Hala spoke to the position of the Syrian people briefly earlier.
أنا سألت إن كان الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية.
I asked about if the United States has a role, directly and indirectly, in terms of the stealing of heritage sites.
هل تقصدني أنا يعني هل تقصد, do you mean that the effect of the rule of the United States in taking the petrol and the effect on the medical service?
لا أنا لا أتحدث عن الآثار.
I'm talking about heritage sites and historic sites. When we learned about agriculture and oil.
My point is
generally, but
to ask about
northeast Syria.
any information you have of the
cultural and historic sites
on the historical Syrian historical
has
sites.
Contributed to the theft of those sites and the potential destruction.
شخصيا أنا لم أدرس الموضوع ولم أجري دراسة عن الموضوع الآثار. حاولت أدرس عن الأشياء الطبية، لكن أحد الزملاء ممكن.
I have attempted to focus on the medical sector, but maybe one of the comrades could highlight the theft of historical sites and the cultural artifacts. So I cannot translate with exact numbers, but I am fully aware and confident that
broke the church and stole some very precious material and brought it to sell it here in the UK. And arrived to the UK, and they were looking how to sell them, including a ring. It is written on it 3 year السنة الثالثة ميلادية. ما كانت تزبط معي إنجليزي.
Yes, year 3 Anno Domini. Does the United, Mr. Muhammad, are you about the role of the United States? Does it have a role in the destruction and theft of the historic sites? Or are you saying that the United States has a role in maintaining those historic sites? Can you explain, please elaborate, Mr. Tayyip?
Okay, so I'm just going to say, we all know about the assassination of Khalid al-Assad, by the ISIS group, who was in charge of Tidmor, one of the most historical parts in Syria. We know what they've done to Ma'lula. Any historical religious site, they meant to destroy. There was a systematic effort of destroying Syria as a civilization. So we know what they've done. So the question is, are we seeking help from the United States to restore, or are you saying, is the United States had a hand in it? Well, we know ISIS was systematically going after, Syrians' artifacts, Syrians' religious sites, Syrian towns, burned to the ground. So there was an effort to destroy Syria as not just today's Syria, but historical Syria. If that answers the question, I'm sorry for that.
Just to add one notice, at some time, I can't remember the year, the Turkish fire jets did hit very precious monuments, 3 churches in the north of Syria in one strike. But I will double check the dates and the place and the name of them. But I remember this in the details happened by the Turkish fire jets.
And I would also just add quickly that the Syrian environment is being destroyed by the U.S. occupation, not only for the aggressive bombing of Raqqa, but also in terms of the mismanagement of U.S. troops, potentially deliberately, because it would destroy Syrian agriculture of the oil sites. There's this leakage of the oil into tributaries in Syria, which not only destroys agriculture, but also sends fumes up into the air, which are toxic for the people around them to breathe, and leads to the reintroduction of a number of illnesses that had previously been eradicated from these areas, including respiratory illnesses. So this is another thing to add to the list of U.S. crimes in the country.
Thank you all very much. Michael Deutsch, Juror Michael Deutsch, do you have any questions for the witnesses?
Yeah, just a short one. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses. They had excellent presentations. I've learned a lot. But I wonder about what is the role of the Kurds, the PKK, and the other militant groups that are fighting the Syrian state?
Excellent question.
I would like to briefly answer from my point of view, and then maybe another point of view can come in. Let's just talk about the Kurds in general. The Kurds in Syria have no historical demographical claim to any part of Syria. Just like the Armenians, they are part of the Syrian community that came in after the genocides that happened, whether it's in Turkey or Iran or Iraq. So to hear that Syrians are trying to be, or some of the Kurds of Syria want to be a separatist group, they have no claim. It can never work, because there's no geographical part of Syria that was part of Kurdistan. It was the northern part, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. So we've taken them in just like we've taken the Armenians. Nobody prior to this war. Now, of course, the Americans wants to mobilize them, wants to use them. And if we remember when Trump decided for a split second that he was going to withdraw his troops from northern Syria, everybody starts screaming, but what about the Kurds? They're our allies. We promised them we can't leave them behind like we leave everybody else's behind. There is no claim. Today, Qassad or the Syrian Democratic Forces, I'm not talking about the KKP, because that's a different rule. But in Syria, we have the Syrian Democratic Forces. They are not doing or playing a clean role. stealing all the resources of Syria with the help of the United States and sending it to Erbil, it's a crime against humanity. It's a crime against the Syrian population. Now, we never wanna or ever wanna think about fighting the Kurds or turning this into a civil or internal fight, but there will be a day when they're gonna stop, when the United States is gonna leave them alone, and we're gonna take them back in like they're Syrian citizens, and this will come to a stop. That's my point on it.
Also burning the crops.
Crops, yeah.
Would anybody else like to speak to this question? No? Okay. And then Victor Good, Juror Victor Good, do you have any questions for the witnesses?
I'll pass on question. I simply want to thank the witnesses for their excellent and informative presentations. And I look forward to taking a closer look at the transcripts to be able to digest the statistics and data that was presented by our witnesses and have a chance to look at it in a lot more detail. So thank you.
And for folks who don't know, Dr. Adnan and Dr. Hala, their electricity is still out. They've been operating, they've been able to participate because of batteries, but the batteries are out now. That's why they haven't been able to answer any questions. I would like to give the jurors an opportunity, since we're taking a break for about a month. Do any of the jurors want to offer reflections on the last couple months of hearings and what we've learned and been witness to? It's been quite devastating, I think, to listen.
I would like to add just a moment of reflection. Certainly one of the things that has impressed me is the enormous level of information about the fundamental violation of international human rights that has been basic policy of our government for decades now, particularly in the Middle East region. And the dearth of that information in our own mass media and in our own popular media, and the ignorance of the American population about what is being done by our government. The American media is in the process right now of a revisionist campaign as it looks at the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And of course, the invasion of Iraq was a springboard for some, though not all, of these human rights violations through sanctions. So I think it's very important that we take an opportunity as popular discussion about this quote unquote 20th anniversary takes place to interject some truth and accuracy to that debate.
Thank you very much, Victor. Any other jurors want to provide some reflections before we wrap up?
Well, I've attended, been privileged to be a jurist on a few of the country's tribunals at this point. And I would say that for me, it just validates and supports my understanding that there's no such thing as a different party view. I saw a film the other night called Boycott, which talks about the BDS movement and how the Democrats are so aligned with supporting Israel and pulling the covers off and exposing the so-called liberals who are just as deadly in their pursuit of this world domination through white supremacy. So for me, it's just been don't stop taking a drink, don't get sober. And also I'm grateful for learning more about the working class movement in particular, because as I think Nina might have said it or someone said it earlier, the working class movements often are underplayed and not really lifted up. And I think that's a class privilege issue that needs to be unpacked at some point. But I've learned so much, and I thank you all for your excellent presentations and for your courage, coming forward and exposing what we know is true and forcing us to look at it head on. Look forward to the next hearings.
Anybody else before we wrap up?
I will just add my voices to those of the other jurors about how critical the testimony that we have received has been over these hearings and how generous the people who have been the direct victims and targets of US imperialism and sanctions have been with their time and energy, including, just as we saw today, 2 of our speakers running down their batteries until the last second to make sure that this testimony is heard. And that speaks to the point that it is so necessary to do more to build international solidarity, that we have a responsibility as jurors, as organizers, as people who are involved in this process of this international tribunal to make sure that these voices are documented, that these crimes are documented, and not just that they're documented, but that they are prosecuted both legally and at a popular level. To hold US imperialism accountable for its crimes, because that won't happen just by calling on officials and waiting. I mean, as we saw just 2 days ago when the International Criminal Court announced an indictment of, not an indictment, an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, when Palestinians have been petitioning the ICC for over a decade, and there's still a discussion about whether it's proper to hear their concerns. And it came just 1 day before the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And yet there has been no justice for the criminals of Bush and Blair and the rest of the imperialist countries that participated in this ongoing crime. So I'm very much looking forward to hear, but it was at the same time very positive to see thousands of people marching in Washington, DC to say that there is an alternative. And so we have a responsibility here to do what we can to make sure that the US is held accountable for these crimes, because this legal work is an important part of pursuing real justice and accountability alongside the popular movements here and alongside the direct movements on the ground that are leading the movement to defend humanity against imperialism. So thanks again to everyone for being, for sharing your time and energy and thoughts today.
Well, thank you all very, very much. And especially, as Charlotte said, special gratitude goes to Dr. Hala and Dr. Adnan. We wish you all the best. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions about any of our work moving forward, please email us. You can find the email address on our website. For the witnesses who would like to submit evidence, we will be in touch about a place to submit that evidence. We've been collecting evidence from all of the witnesses that have presented thus far. And we will see you all in approximately 1 month with Sudan. Take care, and thank you very much.